Hey everyone, this is Theo from Headphones.com, and today I'll be taking a look and sharing my thoughts on the much hyped 7Hz timeless planar IM. Full disclosure, this unit was sent by Linsel. As always, what follows are my honest thoughts and opinions to the best of my ability. Let's get right into it. Alright, so let's go over some of the accessories that you're going to be getting with the timeless. Starting with the case, it is a very industrial-like case. And I say this in the sense that there was like grime smeared on the top of it when I pulled it out of the package brand new. And then moving on from that as well, the inside, the felt, the glue they used with the felt, it sort of bled through and it sort of meshed with it when it dried. And it just has a chemical smell to it in general. I'm really not a fan of this case. Like, it's definitely going to protect your IMs. It's got this nice magnetic latch too. But at the same time, I'm just not really about the industrial thing. I really think they could have gone for a more elegant case, perhaps something along the lines of Moondrop's cases. Here are the included ear tips with the timeless. You have a wide assortment of silicone ear tips. They're all silicone, no foam, but these were the ear tips that I did find to work best with the 7Hz timeless when I was tip swapping. Moving to the cable of the timeless, I actually rather like this cable. For $220, it's pretty solid in my opinion. It's soft, supple, and non-microphonic, and on top of it all, the hardware used on this cable actually I think is quite nice. You can even see that there's some milling work done to the hardware here, which you don't see on a lot of these cheaper cables. You do of course have MMCX connectors up here as well. The timeless itself sports a circular aluminum faceplate meshed with I believe this is a plastic body. Despite some of the build quality memes that I've heard talked about, I don't think that this is a poorly built IM, at least not my sample. The fit on this IM is actually surprisingly good for me. It sits fairly flush with my ears. It's just after a couple of hours that it starts to dig in and I can sort of feel the circular nature of the shell. And if you're interested in how this might fit in your ears, I would take a nickel and stick it in your ear. It's shaped very similarly to the shell of this IM. And while fit is definitely 100% subjective, that might give you a better idea of how this thing is going to work for you. So regarding the actual sound of the timeless, I have to be perfectly blunt when I say that I am not a big fan of it. It is certainly better tuned than any other planar that I've heard to date, like the Odyssey and the Tin Hi-Fi stuff, but that's not a substitute for actually good tuning. That just means that the bar is really, really low. And so I will throw up the frequency response graph on screen so that you guys have a visual to refer to when I illustrate some of the issues that I'm going to point out. And again, to be perfectly blunt, I think that the timeless is really just chock full of minor tuning issues here and there. Starting with the bass on the timeless is quite full on first listen. It's very rotund in the mid bass, a little bit more than I think it should be in fact. And the effect of this is too much pillowiness to bass hits. There's just not enough nuance, and while I did enjoy it on first listen, it's satisfying on first listen, it's really not when you start listening more carefully. It just sounds a little bit more smeared over than it should. Moving into the mid-range, a more minor issue that I have with the tuning of the 7Hz timeless is the degree of the peanut compensation at around like 2.5 kHz or so. It's just a few decibels more than I'd like, and the effect of this is that it sounds more forward than I personally think is neutral. This becomes especially apparent if you use anything other than the stock tips, at least in my experience, and I think it's part of the reason why a lot of people have reported like instances of sibilance. So yeah, I definitely recommend sticking with the stock tips. Personally, I do not find it sibilant. It does slope off of around like 3 kHz properly, but yeah, again, just a little bit too forward in the mid-range at times, and it sort of contrasts weirdly for me at least to the lower mid-range, which is a little bit thicker. Now the treble response is where I find the tuning of the timeless to be even more unrefined. Probably the most unrefined part of the tuning, in fact. There's just not enough lower treble presence at around 5 to 6 kHz, so when you A/B it with something like the Moondrop Kato, percussive hits come across as noticeably like heavier and more defined on the Kato than they do on the timeless. The next issue with the timeless's treble response is a peak at roughly 7 to 8 kHz. And again, this becomes noticeably worse if you use anything other than the stock tips. With the stock tips, I will say it is manageable, but it's still a few decibels more than I like, and it sort of exacerbates that issue in the lower treble where there's just not enough presence. And in fact, it's a little bit of a shame because outside of this, I do think that the sheer extension on the timeless is pretty exemplary for $220. Moving into the technical performance of the timeless, this is where I think that the timeless really makes its mark. Similar to my comments on the treble extension of the timeless, I really cannot think of another IM that has the timeless beat for sheer resolution and clarity. Part of this, again, is just baked into the treble response. That 8 kHz peak and the extension is going to make it sound more resolving than other IMs, but I do feel that the nature of the transients on the timeless are quite fast, faster than any other IM that I've heard for this price point. Price aside, I would say that where the Timeless stumbles most in terms of technical performance would be its imaging. The imaging on the Timeless is honestly kind of mediocre, and I thought it was okay when I first heard it, and then I ended up A/Bing it with some other IMs, and I was like, yeah, no, it sounds pretty closed in. I've seen varying opinions about this online, like some people have even pointed to the frequency response of particular units as being the problem for this, but I've heard 2 units of the Timeless, and I would say that my personal unit is probably the best measuring one that I've seen, and yeah, it still sounds pretty closed in. This becomes especially apparent when you A/B it with something like the, again, the Kato, the Hana 2021, and the Falcon Pro. The Falcon Pro in particular is a good example that sort of exemplifies the shortcomings of the Timeless in the imaging department. If you look at the FR graphs, the Falcon Pro is nowhere near as clean as the Timeless is on paper. It's got way more mid-bass, it's got less peanut compensation, and the treble response is generally smoother and not as airy, which in practice means that it shouldn't sound as clean. And it doesn't, but at the same time, it sounds substantially more open than the Timeless in A/B. Outside of this, something that's more left to personal interpretation, I think, is the sort of planar timbre. If you've heard different driver types, I try to characterize them in terms of shapes sometimes. Transients on BA IMs tend to sound more triangle in nature, whereas so they're a little bit sharper, whereas dynamic driver IMs sound more rectangle in nature, and then planar IMs I would say are more circle in nature. I know that's a funny way of describing it, but that's just the way I sort of visualize them in my head when I'm listening. And so with planar IMs, they sound a little bit soft in the transients, and they sound a little bit, I guess you could say, brushed. They're still very resolving, but it's going to be a love or hate thing for some listeners, I think. And the timbre itself, I would say, is not as pleasing as a dynamic driver is. I would say in general it's better than a balanced armature, but I have heard some balanced armatures that are better than the Timeless. So something that I'm pretty guilty of neglecting are the comparisons, and today I'll be comparing the Timeless to the Moodrep Kato, the Tantrum Hana 2021, and the Dunu Falcon Pro. I think that those are the 3 sort of newish IMs in the $200 price bracket that have been making waves. I don't actually have all the IMs with me. I mostly have the packaging because I loaned them out, but I have A/B'd them all at some point in time. So starting with the Kato and the Hana 2021, I think you can sort of group those together. They're tuned very similarly. The Hana 2021 is just a little bit more V-shaped and a little bit more holographic, so to speak, in its presentation. Basically, these 2 IMs, they are going to have a more, I guess you could say, smooth tonality to them. They don't have that sort of jaggedness in the upper mid-range that the Timeless has, and their treble responses as well tend to be a lot smoother than the Timeless by comparison. So just in general, they're better tuned IMs in my opinion, and they're going to appeal to listeners who are after a smooth, more natural listen. On the other hand, they're not going to stack up for sheer detail retrieval relative to the Timeless. The Timeless does have an edge when it comes to more, I guess you could say, more busy music. It's able to sort of deconstruct the nuances of the track better in those instances, just as a whole. I do think that the Kato in particular, excuse me, not the KXXS, that's the predecessor to the Kato, has better bass control than the Timeless. Now the Falcon Pro, on the other hand, is very much the antithesis of what the Timeless is sort of shooting for. The Falcon Pro is a more warm, less clean, more gooey sort of musical, so to speak, sort of sound. You are definitely going to sacrifice some technicalities, but I do feel that the driver being used on the Falcon Pro is a pretty high quality dynamic driver. The timbre on it is simply better, in my opinion, than the Timeless, and the imaging chops on it as well are much more expansive, even if it's maybe not as precise in terms of localization. The other advantage of the Falcon Pro, of course, is that it is simply built better, as are the other 2 IMs. And with the Falcon Pro, you also have the advantage of the nozzles that you can swap out to better suit the sound to your taste. Timeless is good, but it's also not great. It's good within the context of the planar IM market, and it certainly holds its own in terms of technical performance for $220. But for the same price, I think that there are better packages overall, and the aforementioned Moodrep Kato and the Tantrum Hana 2021 are the IMs that come to mind in particular. But again, if you're after the planar sound and you want that technical advantage, then I would say that the Timeless is a solid recommendation for me. In general, I hope you guys enjoyed this video review. I hope it was maybe refreshing from all the hype surrounding this IM, and I will see you guys in the next one.